Hello folks, I've been getting a decent amount of interest in the Ice Trap Ailment Scaling Saboteur that I've been playing this league, and I've had a lot of fun putting the build together, so I figured I'd do a gear guide video on it. If you're not familiar with the gear guide format, I'm not going to be giving a full build guide here, but I will be going over every single gear slot on the build, with the exception perhaps of flasks, and talking about a basic scepter, a high budget scepter, and a super scepter, for example, as far as the weapon slot is concerned. And I'll have graphics as well, fancy little graphics to accompany me so that you can see examples of what I'm talking about, and I'll probably also have some gameplay footage towards the end of the video, so if you want to see how the build looks, if you're undecided and you might want to pursue it but you want to see some gameplay first, you can just skip to that timestamp and watch a bit, and then come back and look at the gear guide if you're interested in playing it. So, let's get started. We're going to start with the weapon. Now, this build, let me just lay some foundations here, scales the alternate ailments. Those come from Secrets of Suffering, so you're going to need an alternating scepter in order to be able to access those in the first place. This is a core item for the build. It does not really work without it. What the alternate ailments do is threefold. Cold damage that you cause will cause brittle. Brittle causes enemies to be much more likely to be crit, up to 15% bonus base crit versus enemies that are at maximum brittle, which this build achieves even against bosses like Cyrus 8 or T16 Conquerors and other such endgame bosses. You are pretty much always capping brittle if you build a character correctly. Sap, which replaces shock, allows you to lower enemy damage and is one of the primary defensive layers of the character. It lowers damage on enemies by up to 20%, which is quite significant. Arguably better than Fortify and at least as good. So yes, we get that from scaling ailments, and then Scorch causes enemies to lose resistances up to a cap of 30%. We don't always cap Scorch on this build. Finding the fire damage to do so is tough. But we prioritize lightning damage in a number of gear slots in order to cap sap for the defensive properties. If you were playing this build in softcore, you would likely prioritize flat fire in a few of the places where I go for flat lightning in order to scale more damage out of actually capping Scorch as opposed to only getting a 15 to 20% Scorch, since it can cap a little bit higher than that. But the build does more than enough damage without capping Scorch, so it's not really a priority in a hardcore setting, which this character is designed for. So let's get into the weapon, now that I've given you a basic grounding in the character as a whole. As you can see on screen, for your first weapon, obviously you need an alternating scepter for Secrets of Suffering. Your priorities here are going to be a good percent damage roll, ideally spell damage instead of cold damage, so that you're scaling the lightning and fire that the build does as well as the cold, and a good crit multi roll. Crit multi is very important, more important than crit chance, because with capped brittles, crit chance is pretty easy to acquire, so crit multi, to leverage that, is rather important. We also have crafted flat lightning dispels, which is simply to scale the sap for a hardcore setting. As I said, in softcore, maybe consider flat fire. For the upgraded scepter, the high budget scepter, still an alternating scepter that's going to be a constant throughout all this, but you look for a native flat lightning roll as well instead of having to craft it, so you can open up the crafted affix to craft trap throwing speed to make the build play smoother and increase your single target DPS by a bit. It's much more about smoothness of play though, getting that throw speed roll in there. And then for the final scepter, the super scepter, you're going to want all the things we've gotten already, as well as having it be Crusader influenced, which you'll likely need a Crusader Exalted Orb to achieve, and you're trying to get Zealotry Aura effect. The way I would try to craft this is make a really good base scepter in the first place, make sure the affixes are filled so you're not going to slam a prefix, so make sure it's got one more prefix than the one listed on screen here does, maybe some percent spell damage, but it doesn't even matter if it's a dead prefix like mana. And then you Crusader Slam and you hope to get Zealotry Aura effect. Your chances aren't amazing for that, but it does seem like the most effective way to achieve the item, as just like alt spamming for Zealotry Aura effect or something, you're pretty darn unlikely to also then Regal and Exalt Slam into your flat lightning and spell damage. So yes, I would take the Crusader Exalt gamble. But a weapon like this is certainly not necessary, and I don't even have one myself in any of the footage that you've seen. I have a weapon that's roughly equivalent to the high budget scepter, which is quite achievable with essence spam, I find. Alright, we're going to move on to the shield now. For a basic shield, we go really basic. You want a Fossilized Spirit Shield for the highest spell damage implicit, and then you want life and probably also Chaos Res in this slot, because it's convenient to find it here, but it could just be LE Res. That's about it. You could even go for an evasion shield if you prefer, lose a little bit of percent damage, and scale a good amount more evasion as a defensive tool, but I haven't found that to be necessary. For a higher budget shield, you're going to want to fit in some percent damage here. It's got actually a pretty high percent damage roll. High spell damage rolls are kind of hard to hit on shields, so I wouldn't really be too worried if you can't get like 70% or higher. But even something like a 40% spell damage roll, a life roll in the implicit, is going to be a significant upgrade over your basic shield. And then for the super shield, you would want to go a defensive route and get a shaper shield with +2 max res, ideally also still spell damage, and a good life roll. Pretty hard to achieve, but that's going to be the case with most of the super items. And really, you don't need any super items in this build. If you went for a basic or high budget variant in any of the gear slots, you're going to do just fine. The helmet. This is one of the core uniques in the build, and the character does not function without it. Malachi's Awakening provides a huge amount of flat LE damage to spells, and it's spread between every element. That means that this is one of our primary sources of fire and lightning damage, and so is responsible for enabling Secrets of Suffering in the first place, because even if I could sap with my damage, if I'm not doing lightning damage, I'm not gonna sap, so I need that from somewhere. We get a bit on the weapon, and we get a bit more here. On top of that, Malachi's Awakening also conveniently solves our mana problems, and still lets us run Zealotry to scale all of our flat LE damage. If you can, you want to get one with a Ice Trap Pen enchant, and if you want to go all the way, you do Ice Trap Pen plus also a Corruption, but you'd be a crazy person to do that. I'm not gonna bother. You can try it if you want. Alright, let's move on to the chest piece. The most basic option in the chest piece slot, which is not even depicted here in the graphic because I forgot to put it on the graphic, is Shroud of the Lightless. This gives you level 25 LE Pen, and you only have to 5 link it in terms of actual fusing spent, which makes it a fairly cheap option if you can pick one up for, well, relatively cheap without breaking the bank. It's a good option, but it does lack a little bit defensively if we're talking about hardcore. The chest piece I would go as a basic chest in hardcore would be a Warlord-influenced evasion chest piece. Assassin's Garb is your ideal base, but if you can't find that, any decent evasion total will do, and you're looking for Fizz Taken as Fire to help deal with the lack of Fizz mitigation that top right side of the tree builds often have, and obviously a good life roll. If you have an open prefix to craft dodge, even better. Your high budget chest is then going to be still a Warlord base with +1 active gems, Fizz Taken as Fire, and life. This is rather difficult to make, but it is doable with Faceted, Pristine, and Scorched fossils, and it's how I'm going to approach making it. That is the next project for myself for this guide, or for this build, so I may not even have it done if you're watching footage in the background, but I am working on it. The super duper chest piece that you don't really need to go for, but would be utterly fantastic, is a Maven Orb elevated version of the Fizz Taken as Fire, which is a potent elevated mod as it gives you another source of recovery with up to 10% of fire damage taken recouped as life. Again, like all the other super items, not really necessary, but very nice if you can get it. In the glove slot is one of the other core uniques for the build. In fact, the only other core unique for the build, and that is Painseeker. Painseeker provides some more, another smattering of flat lightning and flat fire for us in order to enable Scorch and Sap, but more than that, it enables Scorch and Sap with the inflict non-damaging ailments as though dealing up to 200% more damage modifier. And you would think, on first glance, that these gloves would in fact be kryptonite to the build, would disable it entirely, with the critical strikes don't inherently apply non-damaging ailments line. But that actually does not prevent Secrets of Suffering from allowing you to Sap, Brittle, and Scorch enemies. And I believe that is because Sap, Brittle, and Scorch are not inherently applied by crits, and Secrets of Suffering simply allows you to do so. So it's not an inherent thing, and therefore does not get disabled. That is at least the reasoning that I believe is being followed here. It surprised me that it works as well, but it does in fact work, and it is a massive boon for properly scaling our ailments versus things like high-level Cyrus, Maven, other such bosses. If you want to spend some extra currency, you can try double corrupting Painseekers. I've been doing it a whole bunch this league. Anything with % life is great. The ideal double corrupt is going to be plus max frenzy charges and % life. Now let's move on to the boots. This is another gear slot where we can find some flat lightning in order to scale our saps a little bit better. That is going to be through the flat lightning if you haven't killed recently enchant, and then for a basic pair of boots, just some life and move speed on an evasion base is great. If you go to a higher budget pair of boots, you're probably going to want some fugitive boots to help buff your chaos res somewhat. Which used to be called Blessed Boots. They got renamed this league. They're now Fugitive Boots. And you're going to want them to be Redeemer influenced, ideally, so you can get up to 40% effective non-damaging ailments. I think you can even get 60 if you Maven Orb these, but that's not really necessary. Again, another boon to scaling our Scorch, Sap, and Brittle. Are you seeing a pattern here? Ideally, if you make really nice boots, you're going to want to take the time to enchant them for damage penetrates 10% of enemy Ellie res if you haven't killed recently. This is going to still scale our lightning damage as its generic Ellie pen, but also will scale the cold and fire, and so is a better damage enchant than the flat lightning one. It is much rarer though, so you'll be in lab for a while if you really want that enchant. For the super boots, you stay with Redeemer influence and you go so far as to try and get dodge chance on the boots on top of effective non-damaging ailments. Very difficult pair of boots to craft, but would be quite nice for the build if you could manage it. Let's move on to the amulet slot. For a basic amulet, you're going to be looking for a high crit multi-roll. As I mentioned earlier, this build gets 100% crit chance whenever Brittle is capped, and Brittle is capped very consistently, so crit multi is a super, super powerful stat for us. You're going to want to anoint Stormweaver, which gives both lightning and cold damage, as well as some effect of non-damaging ailments to help scale Sap, Brittle, and Scorch. And you're going to want life and an open suffix for a minimum endurance charge. This is another gear slot where we solve our physical mitigation problems. You may also require an intelligence roll here, or just a higher intelligence implicit than an Onyx amulet. Results may vary depending on where you can get stats otherwise. For a higher budget amulet, you're going to want a Redeemer influenced amulet. We like Redeemer influence in this build. You can either go for effective non-damaging ailments here, but more potent than that is +1 all cold skill gems. In theory, you could also use a Hunter amulet with +1 to Dex gems, but you want the Redeemer one for the off chance that you hit the God roll and also land ailment effect on top of plus gems, however unlikely that is. May as well give yourself the chance to get super lucky, right? And then for the super duper amulet, you're going to want to go for Redeemer still, and ideally you're going to be aiming for damage penetrates cold res, +1 cold gems, crit multi, and life. And yeah, that's really hard to make, but again, like every other super item in this build, you don't really need it. If you stick to even just the basic items in this build, you should be able to handle red maps and a lot of endgame bosses without too much trouble. Speaking of basic items, let's move on to basic rings. Life and a stat roll. You don't need much out of the ring slot to begin with. Your basic rings are probably going to be where you solve stat problems. The build is a little bit int hungry, not too smart being on the right side of the tree, so you need to pick up some on gear, and then obviously life is good. For a higher budget ring, you're probably going to go for life, maybe stats, crit multi if you can get it from Essence of Scorn, and then you're also going to want an open suffix for min endurance charge, again, to help solve phys mitigation problems. One of your rings may eventually want to be an Ellie weakness on hit ring. You can simply self-cast Ellie weakness and you don't really lose much in the way of damage, but an Ellie weakness on hit ring or glove corrupt will make things a lot smoother and you won't have to press as many buttons in boss fights, which is always nice. If you want to go for a disgustingly good ring, you would go for a Vermilion ring base with life, with crit multi, with curse on hit, with min endurance charge, but you don't need to go quite that far. Now, for the belt, we're going to be looking for trap throwing speed. That is a craft that you can get through unveiling on belts, as well as life, and of course any resistances that you need. All of these items, I'm simply highlighting the core mods. I am assuming that you're going to find resistances with some of these open suffixes. You do need to cap your res, as with any build. For a higher budget belt, you're going to want a Hunter influenced belt, ideally still a Stygian Vise, and you're looking for percent life, and throwing speed, as before. If you wanted to, instead of scaling percent life here, you could go for a Warlord belt and look for life recovery rate, which wouldn't be awful. It would help scale the regen quite a bit, but I would prefer the extra max life from a Hunter belt personally. For your super duper belt, you're going to want a Hunter belt, as mentioned earlier, with life, percent life, and then the Essence of Zeal trap and mine throwing speed roll, which gets pushed further than the trap throwing speed from a craft, but really not very much further, 5 or 6%, to the point where the amount of currency invested to make such a belt is likely not worth it unless it's like your final upgrade. But in theory, you could go for something like this. So, I believe that covers all of the different gear slots. Thanks for watching the video. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking around through it all. There will be some gameplay footage right after I'm done talking here, like I mentioned at the top of the video. If you have any questions about any of the gear slots in the build and you need them answered, be sure to ask them, and feel free to ask them in the comments below. Like I said, I haven't perfectly min-maxed the character myself, so if you want to see further progression of it, you can always tune into my stream. I'm probably still going to be playing this build. I've been really enjoying it. Unless I die, of course, you know, it's always an option. And there will be more guide content on this character coming, such as things about what links to do, how to level it, all that sort of stuff. This was merely a gear guide that I wanted to put out to get people some sort of semblance of content on the character, since a lot of folks have expressed interest and have been telling me that they need some guidance on what gearing they should do and what items they should be getting. There will be a path of building in the description below with all of the different items in it, so you can mess around and see what the damage values are, depending on whether you have, you know, a few high budget pieces of gear, whether you have all of them equipped, whether you have all basic items. You can mess around with that to your heart's content. And of course you could, you know, make some of your own custom items or search for things off trade, throw them in, and see how they compare. But yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.